Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about the development of bands in America and how they eventually became a regular part of public education. Today, band is one of the most common music classes offered in American schools. Marching bands are a recognizable part of American culture, and most of us probably were either in band or friends with someone who was. However, band did not simply appear in schools overnight. Their development was influenced by military tradition, religious communities, social changes, technology, and educational reform that took place over several centuries. My goal today is to trace that development and show how these different influences eventually led to the rise of school bands. To understand why this history matters, it helps to consider where we are today. Research shows that roughly 87% of public middle and high schools offer band classes. Band is the most commonly offered ensemble in American schools, and marching bands have become deeply connected to American culture. Because bands are now so widespread, it can be easy to assume they have always been this way. In reality, the school band is relatively recent, and it grew out of many earlier traditions. This slide will provide a timeline for our presentation. We will start with the European roots, pre-1800, then look at bands in colonial America, examine developments during the 19th century, and finally discuss the factors that helped bands become established in schools during the early 20th century. The story begins in Europe. Long before modern bands existed, wind instruments were already being used in churches and royal courts. Instruments such as cornets, trombones, and oboes often were used in these ensembles, and cornets and trombones were often used to double vocal parts in church music. These instruments were also used for festivals, ceremonies, and celebrations. While these ensembles were not bands in the modern sense, they helped establish many of the instruments that would later become standard in bands. Military bands were probably the most important influence on the development of bands. European armies adopted military music traditions after contact with the Islamic Middle East during the Crusades. Early military bands used drums and trumpets to communicate where their bases were in the dust and chaos of battle. Over time, instrumentation expanded. Fifes were included in military units for the cheerfulness of soldiers, as one 1622 military training book said. Oboes began to be used by the French military and would later become more widely popularized through harmony music. By the early 1700s, military bands were beginning to include horns, trumpets, fifes, oboes, drums, and occasionally clarinets. Another important influence came from the Ottoman Empire, or what we might know today as Turkey, since they exist where the Ottoman Empire used to exist. European armies adopted Turkish percussion instruments such as bass drum, cymbals, tambourines, and triangles. These instruments added volume and excitement to military music. Their inclusion was so influential that additional instruments like piccolos and trombones were added to balance the volume of the larger percussion section. Many of these percussion instruments remain staples of band instrumentation today. We are now in pre-revolutionary America. One of the earliest settlers of colonial America were the Moravians. The Moravians were highly musical religious settlers who established communities in places like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They formed some of the earliest instrumental ensembles in the colonies. Their emphasis on music and their heavy use of brass instruments helped preserve and promote ensemble music in early America. The Moravians also helped introduce harmony music traditions into America. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what harmony music was. A typical harmony music ensemble would be made of a pair of oboes, a pair of horns, and a pair of bassoons, or something similar to that. Sometimes the oboes were replaced with clarinets. Sometimes they would add trumpets or percussion in there. But this was a very, very common movement in Europe throughout the 1700s. David Moritz Michael, a German-trained musician, brought these traditions with him and led public concerts featuring these clarinets, horns, bassoons, and other wind instruments. An interesting detail is that many of the pieces performed by the harmony music ensembles were written in B-flat and E-flat keys. These are keys that remain fairly popular and almost too popular in band music today. Military influence continued in colonial America. British regiments brought harmony music traditions with them as well during the French and Indian War. At the same time, American military groups relied heavily on fifes and drums for communication. These military ensembles helped spread band traditions throughout the colonies. Bands were not limited to military use. Many colonial newspapers frequently mention bands performing at festivals, commencements, and public celebrations. Harmony music ensembles performed in places such as New York City, and bands became a regular part of civic life. By the late colonial period, bands had already established themselves as both practical and entertainment-oriented ensembles. After the Revolution, the military bands briefly declined because the army became much smaller. There was no longer a need to keep a well-regulated army. However, concerns about unrest eventually led to the passage of the 1792 Militia Act, which greatly expanded state militias. This increased the demand for field musicians and ceremonial bands, helping bands continue to grow throughout the country. Bands also became popular because they played music people enjoyed. Unlike many formal art music traditions, bands frequently performed familiar patriotic songs and folk tunes. Audiences recognized the music and could connect with it easily. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution provided more leisure time and disposable income, allowing more people to participate and enjoy musical activities. Technology also played a major role. Keyed brass instruments and later valved brass instruments dramatically improved the flexibility of brass playing. These developments made brass instruments easier to learn and more musically capable. As a result, brass bands became increasingly popular throughout the 19th century. One of the most influential figures of this era was Patrick Gilmore. Gilmore immigrated from Ireland and eventually formed one of the most successful bands in America. During the Civil War, his band, along with many other bands, joined the Union Army. And after the war, he organized enormous musical spectacles. These spectacles were made with the intent of quelling some of the unrest and tensions between the North and South. His performances included hundreds of musicians, thousands of singers, cannon fire, and elaborate pageantry. Gilmour demonstrated that bands could attract massive audiences and serve as major public entertainment. If Gilmour laid the foundation, John Philip Sousa expanded it even farther. As director of the Marine Band, Sousa dramatically improved the ensemble's reputation. He also embraced new technology through recordings and helped popularize band music through extensive touring. After his tenure with the Marine Band, John Philip Sousa would go on to make his own private band. This touring band exposed countless Americans to high-quality band performances and helped make the concert band a respected artistic ensemble. At the same time, schools were beginning to expand their music programs. Progressive education encouraged schools to offer a broader curriculum, and music increasingly came to be viewed as important for citizenship and character development. Schools began offering credit for music classes, purchasing instruments, and creating opportunities for students to participate in ensembles. Several factors combined to make the school bands possible. After World War I, many military musicians returned home looking for work. Sound movies also displaced many theater musicians. This created a large supply of qualified band musicians to serve as music teachers. At the same time, instrument manufacturers became concerned about declining sales and began investing heavily in school music programs and competitions. Together, these factors helped school bands spread rapidly across the country. Another important figure was Austin Harding and the University of Illinois. Harding helped establish many traditions associated with modern bands. He elevated performance standards, improved instrumentation practices, encouraged marching band innovation, and helped create one of the first university band programs. His influence reached far beyond Illinois and helped shape the development of school bands nationwide. When we look at the rise of school bands, it becomes clear that no single event created them. School bands emerged from centuries of military traditions, religious communities, civic music making, technological innovation, educational reform, and influential leaders like Patrick Gilmour, John Philip Sousa, and Austin Harding. By the 1920s, these forces had combined to make school bands a common feature of American education. The band programs we know today are the result of a long historical process that connected European traditions, American society, and educational change. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.